All right, so are you ready for some, like, serious political drama?
Oh, yeah, always.
Okay, good. Because we are headed up to Maine,
Yeah.
where President Trump is threatening to pull $250 million
Whoa.
in education funding.
Wow.
And the reason why is because they are refusing to follow his order about transgender athletes in school sports.
Okay.
So basically, it's Governor Janet Mills saying nope to Trump.
Uh-huh.
And now, like, everyone is waiting to see who, like, blinks first.
Right.
We've got some articles that break down both sides of this whole standoff.
Yeah.
So
Let's get into it.
yeah, let's unpack what's really at stake here.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one because it really does go way beyond just sports, you know?
Right.
You've got this collision of state versus federal power.
Uh-huh.
Obviously, huge implications for LGBTQ plus rights.
Yeah.
And then you can't forget the 2024 election is kind of looming in the background here.
Right. Yeah.
So if you want to understand what's happening in America right now, this fight over who gets to play is a pretty good place to start, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so back in February, Trump issues this executive order that says that transgender women can't compete in women's sports.
Right.
And he says it's about fairness,
Right.
but it's also clearly a move that, like, fires up a lot of his base.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, this whole anti-woke movement has gained some serious traction.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that, like, over 24 other states have already jumped on this bandwagon.
Really?
They've passed laws similar to Trump's order. So this isn't just a Maine thing. You know, this has become a national debate.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of folks are willing to see how Maine's defiance plays out.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there's a potential domino effect here.
So Maine has basically become the testing ground.
I think that's a really good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a lot of pressure on Governor Mills.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And she's not exactly backing down either.
She's been very vocal, calling the order discriminatory, saying it goes against Maine's values of inclusivity.
Mm.
And this isn't their first rodeo with Trump either.
Right.
Remember back in 2023, they blocked him from their 2024 ballot because of a January 6th.
Right.
That decision's actually still pending with the Supreme Court.
Oh, wow.
So there's like this whole other layer of legal drama that's kind of intertwined with all of this.
Oh, wow. So this isn't just about one executive order.
No.
It's like years of tension finally coming to a head.
Exactly. And it gets even more complex, I think, when you look at why this issue resonates so strongly with Trump's base. You know,
Yeah.
We're talking about anxieties over changing social norms, you know, traditional gender roles being challenged.
Right.
It taps into a very specific set of fears and values.
Right.
So for them, this isn't about sports, you know,
Right.
it's about something much bigger.
Okay, so we've got this clash of ideologies, and Maine is stuck in the middle, but practically speaking, like, what does that mean?
Right.
What happens if they actually lose that $250 million?
Well, for starters, it would be a massive blow to Maine's education system. You know,
Yeah.
that funding supports everything from teacher salaries to special programs. Losing it would force some really tough choices, you know,
Yeah.
larger class sizes, maybe even cutting essential courses.
Right.
It's not a pretty picture.
So it's like holding their schools hostage.
Yeah.
Follow our rules, or
It definitely raises questions about, you know, whether the federal government should be using funding as leverage in this way.
Right.
Is it really about ensuring compliance with Title IX, which prohibits sex-based discrimination in education? Or is it more about, like, pushing a specific agenda?
Yeah.
And there's the question of what this means for the kids who depend on those school programs.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's a lot for Maine to be juggling. But let's step back for a second and look at the other side of the argument.
Right.
You hear people saying that allowing transgender women in women's sports creates an unfair advantage.
Right.
They talk about biological differences, things like bone structure and
Mm.
muscle mass. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's definitely more complicated than some people make it out to be.
Okay.
When you dive into the science, there's actually no clear consensus on how much of an advantage, if any, these biological differences provide, especially when you factor in hormone therapy.
Right.
And, you know, a lot of athletic organizations already have rules in place about hormone levels for transgender athletes.
Uh-huh.
It's not like this is a brand new concept they're just figuring out.
So it's not as simple as saying all transgender women are going to be bigger and stronger, so they'll automatically dominate.
Right. It's much more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Plus, reducing it to a biological equation completely ignores the individual journeys of these athletes.
Yeah.
You know, we have to remember we're talking about real people, each with their own unique story.
And for a lot of these transgender athletes, being able to compete in a way that aligns with their gender identity is deeply personal.
Yeah.
It's about so much more than just winning or losing. Exactly.
It's about being seen, being validated, being able to fully express who they are. And for many, particularly younger athletes, being part of the team can be crucial for their social and emotional well-being.
Right.
It's a place where they can find acceptance and support, which can be especially important considering the higher rates of bullying and harassment that transgender youth often face.
So for them, being excluded from sports isn't just disappointing, it can be really damaging.
Absolutely. And that's where you see the arguments for inclusion and human rights coming in.
Right.
Opponents of the ban argue that it's discriminatory and sends a harmful message, basically telling transgender people that they aren't fully accepted or valued.
Yeah.
They see this as an attack on their very identity and an attempt to erase their existence from public spaces.
And it ties into that larger debate we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
It's that clash of worldviews, the traditional versus the progressive.
Right. One side sees this as a threat to established norms and values, while the other sees it as a necessary step towards a more just and equitable society. And Maine is right in the center of that cultural tug-of-war.
Okay, so Maine's got all these different pressures, the potential loss of funding the legal battle, brewing this national debate raging around them. What do you see as the most likely outcome here?
Yeah.
Do they cave fight? What?
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
Governor Mills has said she's willing to fight this all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary, and she's definitely shown she's not afraid to stand up to Trump.
Right.
But that would be a long, expensive battle, and there's no guarantee they'd win.
Right.
The Supreme Court's been pretty unpredictable lately. So it's tough to predict how they'd rule on a case like this.
And even if they did win, would it even solve the bigger issue?
That's a good point.
This whole debate isn't just going to disappear overnight.
You're right, and that's why even if Maine loses in court, their stand could still have a significant impact.
Okay.
By refusing to back down, they're sending a powerful message to other states and transgender people across the country. They're showing that this is an issue worth fighting for, that transgender rights are human rights, and that they deserve equal protection under the law.
It's almost like they're drawing a line in the sand.
Exactly. And that could embolden other states to resist similar federal mandates.
Right.
It could inspire more transgender athletes to speak out and fight for their right to compete. So even if they lose this specific battle, they could still win the larger war for hearts and minds.
It's about changing the conversation, moving it away from fear and exclusion and towards acceptance and understanding.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that diversity makes us stronger, and we all benefit when everyone has the opportunity to participate fully in society, whether that's in sports, in school, or anywhere else.
Okay, so we've talked about the politics and like the potential consequences for Maine schools
Right.
and the broader impact this could have, on the national conversation.
Uh-huh.
But let's zoom in for a sec on the core arguments.
Okay.
For and against transgender athletes participating in women's sports. What are like the key points each side is making?
Well, you hear a lot about protecting women's sports,
Yeah.
making sure cisgender women aren't disadvantaged.
Right.
That's a major point for those who support the ban. They often highlight the potential physiological differences,
Right.
suggesting transgender women might have an inherent edge in things like strength, speed, or endurance.
But you mentioned earlier that the science isn't really settled on that, and there's the whole hormone therapy factor.
Exactly. Hormone therapy can significantly alter those physical characteristics. And like I said before, many athletic organizations already have guidelines in place regarding hormone levels for transgender athletes.
Right.
So it's not like this is some completely uncharted territory.
So then the question becomes, where do you draw the line?
Right.
How do you define what level of difference is fair or unfair?
Yeah.
And who even gets to make that call?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
Because as we've seen, this issue gets tangled up with social and political beliefs. It's not just about science or athletic performance.
Right.
It's about how we view gender fairness and inclusion as a society.
Right. And for the folks who are against the ban, those ideas of inclusion and human rights are at the forefront.
Yeah.
They're saying that excluding transgender athletes sends a message that they're not truly accepted or valued.
Absolutely. And it reinforces the stigma and discrimination that they already face in many aspects of their lives.
Yeah.
They see this as an attack on their identity, an attempt to erase their existence from public life. And for transgender youth especially, having the chance to play sports can be so crucial for their development.
Right.
You know?
So it goes beyond wins and losses.
Yeah,
It's about being part of a team, building those connections, and feeling like you belong.
exactly.
Mhm.
Denying them that opportunity can have serious consequences for their mental health and well-being,
Right.
especially when you consider that transgender youth are already at a higher risk for bullying and harassment.
Yeah.
Sports can be a safe haven for a lot of these kids.
It feels like this whole situation is just so layered and complex.
It is.
You've got these two sides with valid points, but they're coming from such different places that it's hard to imagine finding any kind of common ground.
It's definitely a challenge, but that's exactly why these conversations are so important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we need to listen to different perspectives, try to understand where people are coming from, even when we disagree.
Right.
Shouting at each other across the political divide isn't going to solve anything.
Okay, so if our listener is trying to keep up with this story as it unfolds,
Right.
what should they be paying attention to?
Well, first off, keep an eye on what happens with the Department of Education's investigation in Maine.
Okay.
Their findings could really shape how this case moves forward.
And if Maine decides to take legal action,
Yeah.
could that set off a chain reaction in other states?
It's definitely possible we could see a wave of lawsuits challenging similar bans across the country.
Uh-huh.
And depending on how those cases play out, it could eventually end up in the hands of the Supreme Court.
Which would be a huge deal.
Yeah.
It could redefine the future of transgender rights in America.
Exactly. So this case, in Maine, it's about so much more than just sports.
Right.
It's about fairness, inclusion, equality, those core values that are at the heart of who we are as a country.
It's a reminder that these issues are complex and there are no easy answers.
Right.
But we need to keep talking, keep learning, and keep striving for a society where everyone feels seen and valued.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And for all you listeners out there, here's something to think about. How might this case in Maine connect to their decision to block Trump from the 2024 ballot if the Supreme Court sides with Maine on that issue? Could it weaken Trump's leverage in this whole funding standoff, or could it make things even more heated as we get closer to the election? It's definitely something to ponder.
Wow, yeah, that's a great point. It's like all these different pieces are fitting together, creating this huge, complicated puzzle of American politics and social change, and we're right here in the middle of it trying to figure it all out.
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? The world is always changing, and we get to explore those changes together, challenge our assumptions, and keep learning.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for diving into this with me. It's been a really eye-opening conversation.
My pleasure. Always enjoy unraveling these complex topics with you.
And to our listeners, keep those brains buzzing. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.